What I'm going to do is, again, just dip my toe in and not give a complete story of trauma-informed practice, because, again, it's not possible. But I just want to get my head around kind of, well, what is trauma and what kind of does it do to children, and therefore, why would it be important that our practice should be trauma-informed? And if it's trauma-informed, what does that kind of look like? Okay, so that's roughly how I kind of did it. And in the words of the great voice, but I did it my way. So, again, those of you who know, who've heard me speak, this is not the truth. This is just one woman's way of explaining the stuff that she's seen and she's heard over the years. I want to give voice to what trauma is before I refocus on what trauma-informed practice is. And I'm sure you're wondering in this room, why is she doing that? We're trauma trained. We know, because I've trained most of you in trauma practice. Why I want to do that is I think we're currently living and working in an era which is very dominated by the brain. And I love neuropsych, you know it. I love mass synapses firing. Well, as you saw, I love anything firing. However, neural firing is not trauma. And the more I sit with my colleagues, we've slightly, gone a little bit askew sometimes. And so for me to talk about trauma without pausing to connect to the lived experience of children would be me betraying, and I don't like betrayal. It would be me standing before you risking sanitizing the kind of filth that trauma brings, and it would be me not feeling their pain, and it would be me distancing myself from my part in it. So I paused when I was writing this, and will not say last night because that makes me look really unprofessional. I pulled it together last night, but I paused again. And when I paused and when I closed my eyes, this beautiful eagle swept in to my imagination, and I jumped upon her back, and she took me up, and she said, "Mary Jo, this is what trauma looks like at a global level, and this is just some of it. It is the human trafficking and sexual trading of our children, one of the biggest industries globally, as we sell their bodies. It is the mutilation of their bodies for sexual and commercial gain. It is the economic slavery of children for the greed of a corporate few. It is the unimportant and indeed the targeted casualties in war zones. It is preventable death and disease because of the lack of basic amenities. And it is religious and racial intolerance." And then the eagle swooped closer to home, and on a national scale, I saw much the same. I saw the human trafficking and sexual trading of our children. As we're sitting here today, it's happening. The mutilation of their bodies for the sexual and commercial gain of a few. The economic exploitation for the greed of a corporate few. And you can just walk into any shopping centre here in Sydney. The unimportant and indeed the targeted casualties, for example, our Aboriginal communities, our refugee communities, and our economically disadvantaged communities, so that the few can live in comfort. The racial and religious intolerance. Here in Australia, preventable disease and death because of lack of basic amenities. A homeless rate that defies belief here in Australia, and the percentage of our young people who are homeless in this country. And a mental health and a suicide rate that is a national emergency among our young people. And then the bird came to land. And it came into the homes and the nations, and it came into the work that we do. And I saw the abuse and denigration of our children further. Physical torture inflicted upon them, wanton neglect, sexual violence, and emotional and psychological annihilation of who they are. And so that was my journey. And so I can't sanitize, and I can't separate myself. And I can see where my responsibility lies. And when I saw that, I said to myself, how can we not be trauma-informed practitioners? So what was I seeing with the effects of trauma? Let me quote a man who wrote 200 years ago. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy well, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swings, finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same. Deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Self goes itself, myself it speaks, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. Crying, what I do is me, for that I came. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a great poet, Jesuit priest, so certainly did not think I was going to quote him 200 years later when I was thinking about trauma-informed practice. And what's he got to say about trauma-informed practice? When we study close his words, we discover that he believes that the kingfisher, the dragonfly, each stone, each bell was created just as they are. And we discover that he writes that all of creation, all ourselves, each individual person in this room cries out their uniqueness just by existing. That's it. That's the gig, folks. We don't have to achieve anything to be beautiful or to be loved. We don't have to prove anything, and we don't have to be anything other than what we were born to be. It is our very divine existence that is precious. Our individual existence cries out from every part of our spirit, what I do is me, for that I came. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a tortured soul who knew trauma, is telling us with the portrait of his words that we are each born to sing our unique song, the unique song of our divine existence. And I believe that trauma steals that. That's, for me, are the effects of trauma. Not the symptom checklist, not the DSM-5, not all the assessments I've ever done in my life, but that song. I have a belief that children are born to sing harmoniously. Themselves, who they are, is a harmonious, beautiful thing, and to relate with everybody in harmony. That's my belief. Don't have any evidence for that, but hey, who cares? Let's fly in the face of a little bit of evidence-based practice this morning. I can do that until you take the mic off me. And what we know is when you are in harmony, and when you're relating in harmony, you're safe. And when you're safe, you can grow and blossom and develop. And just that beautiful sense of safety and harmony, just sing to each other. That lovely vibration you get when music's in perfect tune. It's my belief that when trauma impacts children, they are pulled away from that harmony. And they have to, because they have to protect themselves. And you can't move towards safety and growth at the same time as you move towards protection. Not possible. You got to say, okay, I've got to do what am I going to do? And when trauma's coming at you, you got to go, okay, I need to protect. And so you're pulled away from that beautiful sense of safety. and harmony. And I believe there's different ways, and I've seen children pulled away in different ways. I've seen them pulled into that place I call rigidity, where they have to, everything has to be as it is, because it's safe, and if they know and it's predictable, and don't change anything, and whatever you do, Mary Jo, don't move the sofa in the blue therapy room. Because if you do, I'm about to go off. Okay? They gotta go there. Or they come into here, chaos. There is no harmony. So it's just everywhere. They're bouncing off any wall that will come near them. Pure chaos. Or then another direction that they're pulled to is what I call the undefended heart. You know, that it's so open, that it's just vulnerable to being ripped apart by anybody and anything. Or they move in another direction, which is so shut down, and they move away from self and relationships. Now, all of you know that we could possibly put diagnoses onto each of those. I know, certainly they come into our rooms in Cara with certain labels, and if that word's useful, I'm not going to critique that word for now. If a diagnosis of any of those ways of being pulled out of harmony serves children, go for it. But I prefer to think of it that way, of the effects of trauma pulling away. Because when I think of that, I think to myself, okay then, Mary Jo, what is your duty to children? What part can you play in bringing them back into that beautiful center place of harmony? And what part do we play in supporting family to bring them back into that place of harmony? You're kidding me. Halfway, sweetie. You see that? I'm only saying hello. I love this one when she does the old, she knows me. She gives me the old signals. And what is our part in community bringing children back into harmony? And again, I believe it's trauma-informed practice. And why I think it's important is because I believe that children's preferred way of being in the world is to live in a family free of abuse. Anybody else agree with me? Say aye. Aye. Love you. I want to hear it louder. Say aye. Aye. Love yous. Right? I think that's a gig. I think they really, really, really do want to live with their families and not be abused. And I think their preferred way of living is not to exhibit behaviors that cause themselves and others harm. What do you reckon? Say aye to that one. Absolutely. Oh, sorry, I swore. It's not even 10 o'clock, is it? Oh my God. I usually swear after 10 o'clock. Before 10 o'clock. Anyway. I don't think they want to exhibit all those behaviors. I believe that they want to sing in harmony with themselves and with others. And therefore, it is important to locate our work with children and their families in the trauma field, because it locates the problem where, certainly not inside the child's individual pathology, it locates the problem in the context, in the abuse. And so why aren't we medicating the abusive actions? Why aren't we labeling them the abusive actions? Why do we send children, you are, and you will? Kind of fascinates me, but anyway. In locating children's symptomology, because there is symptomology and there is behavior. I know, I get some of the little darlings climbing up walls at Cara House. I see it. I certainly see the symptomology, but I think a trauma-informed practice is important, because instead of having it in the individual's mental functioning, the emphasis is on us adults to feel that pain. It's the gig, darlings. It's what we signed up for. Not to flick a page of the DSM-5, not to be really, really, really fancy in how we type up an assessment report. Our gig, feel the pain. But don't be burdened by it. It can be liberating. Because then we can take steps to do something with it. Then we can. Trauma gives children the messages that they are unlovable. Well, it must be, because I'm living with this group called family, and family's meant to be the great place where you're loved, so it must be me. And trauma gives the message that relationships, no, untrustworthy. Because it wasn't a falling tree or a tsunami that traumatized children, it was abuse. It was relationships that traumatized children. And it gives the message that this world, not a good place. Unsafe, unsafe, unsafe. There's not much room for uniqueness of a child's song. There's not much in the words of our opening song. How can anyone ever tell you you're anything less than beautiful? Because that's what trauma says. Trauma says you're unlovable. In relationships, untrustworthy. In this world, unsafe. Trauma-informed practice is important because I want everybody in this room to be part of the UN force. I bet you never thought you were going to join the UN forces, did you? It's all politics. Have you noticed? I'm Irish. Can't be anything but politics, darling, really. We are part of undoing. Because there may be 3 ons, but it only takes 1 on. The undoing of those messages. So what is this trauma-informed practice? If any of you have been lucky enough to read the work of Alice Miller, Alice wrote in the 1950s, didn't she, in Europe? Alice talked about the enlightened witness. So trauma-informed practice is walking the path of the enlightened witness. An enlightened witness is not a disinterested bystander. An enlightened witness does not leave a young person on their own on the court steps and says it's somebody else's business. An enlightened witness, rather, is an activist. Oh my God, I've got you in the UN forces and I've got you being activists. God knows what I'm going to do to you by the end of this talk. Oh, I'm going to have you singing. That's what I'm going to have. You're going to be singers as well. It's someone who's actively, knowingly, and from an informed, that's the enlightened bit, position, compassionately engages children. That's the C word, compassion. Not clinically, compassionately. So we all know that trauma changes children. We all know they're different because abuse is sculpted onto their bodies and onto their hearts and into their spirits, those messages of unworthiness. From neural firing to visceral priming, from the flooding of the adrenal system to the DNA receptors, right down to the building blocks of life, trauma changes our children. And I don't mean it makes them different as in unequal or less of a person, but definitely different. And if we're not trauma-informed practitioners, we're not going to get that difference. And we're not going to be enlightened witnesses. And we will not understand the oppression of violence and how it can change someone. And we will expect children to function at the same level as non-traumatized children. And it's still happening as I'm speaking today. As I go back to work this afternoon, as I was in work yesterday, we as a profession, we as a society, we as a global community still expect traumatized children to be as non-traumatized children. Who here in the room would ask a child with a physical disability, with paralyzed legs, in a wheelchair, to run in exactly the same school race as a child with 2 legs? Who? No, like no one. You'd say, don't be ridiculous, Mary Jo. I can see they can't be in the same school race. Really? We can say that? What if your eyes could actually see the toxic flooding from the adrenal system that causes a child's regulatory system to make it impossible for them to sit their bottoms on a chair in the class? What if you could see that? And what if your eyes could see the amygdala? Not think about it, but see it. Activate its threat detector. Switch off its social reproach mechanism every time a professional tries to engage with them, even when we're being nice. What if our eyes could see this direct switching off of the oxytocin dopamine receptors by the stress hormones, does it? Just switches it off. Which means that happiness is more chemically difficult. What if we could see that? Would we still call them ADHD, ASD, ODD, etc., etc., etc.? Would we still recommend, and this is directly from my files, not me, children will be referred to me, would we still recommend that a 3-year-old be prescribed antipsychotic medication, that a 6-year-old be diagnosed with schizophrenia, or a 4-year-old be labeled as a sex offender and asked to leave the preschool? I would love that to be fiction. I would love it, but it's not fiction. It's science fact. It is science fact, not science fiction. And yet we herald ourselves as a great scientific clinical profession. What if our eyes could see the visceral suffering, the pain energy emanating from their hearts? I believe that a trauma-informed practitioner does see. I'm in called weird because I believe that. I've always been called weird because I say I see it. And in the seeing, the trauma-informed practitioner is not merely content with behavior-based interventions that are heavily reliant on cognitive interventions, behavior management approaches, or pharmacological solutions. They have a place, but not merely contented with that, and certainly not interested in methods that further traumatize children and their families. The enlightened practitioner, the trauma-informed practitioner, gets it, that we must see with a compassionate heart, and our interventions must be different. The trauma practitioner is interested in work which is led by the compassionate heart and informed by the knowing head. Very different way, very, very different way of being. And that understands the effects of trauma on the whole of the body, not just the brain, darlings. I am not sitting looking at disembodied brains. I'm standing, actually, I'm not sitting at all. You're sitting, I'm standing. I'm standing looking at full-blown flesh, blood, brain, heart, guts, skeleton, nervous system. And when you're traumatized, that's where the message sits in, the whole of body. I'm working with a young man, 56 he is, a survivor of an orphanage in the south of Ireland. He found his way to me here on the shores of Australia. And he described, when was I here? Was it Monday? Monday afternoon, so I saw him in the morning before I came here. And he said to me, Mary Jo, my trauma, and his words were, and he's not trauma trained, he said, what happened to me in childhood? He said, I feel it in a deep, deep, visceral way. He said, it's deep in my bones, Mary Jo. It's in my cells. It's in my soul. Not trauma trained. He wasn't trauma trained. But he got it. But if he was to speak like that, if he was to use the words, trauma's in my cells and in my soul as a keynote speaker, well, who would do that in their right mind? People go, really? Sure about that? The trauma-informed practitioner listens and sees that. He went on to talk about St. Paul, by the way. Now, not the St. Paul you think, Paul Keating. Anyway. And he said, oh, I dropped my political allegiance there, haven't I? And when he was telling me about this being the trauma sitting in the very cells, in his very soul, he said he was listening to some of Paul Keating's talks or something. I can't remember. Anyway. And Paul Keating talked about his granny. Now, Irish people love their grannies. Say it to me, and well, not when they shut down the whole electrical system. And there's something very, very important. Your granny's extremely important. And I'll call this guy Jimmy. So when Jimmy was saying, and Mary Jo was listening to Paul's speech, and he was talking about how much he was loved by his granny. And he could go into any parliamentary discussion. He could face anybody. He said because he knew he had an asbestos suit because his granny loved him. No matter what anybody said, he says his granny loved him. And Jimmy said to me, Mary Jo, I don't have an asbestos suit. So I controversially said, oh, Jimmy, 56, let's start making one. Never too late, sweetie. Never, never too late. And the trauma-informed practitioner gets that. Never, never give up. Never give up. So you're now tailors. All right, so you're going to make asbestos suits. What have I had you doing so far? UN forces, become a tailor, it's great. So let me jump back on the bird again and see what I saw, what trauma-informed practice looked like. On the global level, I believe that trauma-informed practice is the halting of the lethargy amongst powerful governments of this industrial world, so that they will take a more active stand against the sexual and economic exploitation of our children. It is a greater reluctance to go to war and accept the human carnage, and for the purpose of this paper, particularly to accept the human carnage of children. And it is the cessation of geopolitical pettiness, and it is pettiness, and more attention put to preventable death and diseases from the lack of basic human amenities. And it is the will to love and protect this planet that we call home. We're a smart cookie. We are, as a species, we're smart. I will not accept any great political power saying they don't have the will and the know-how to protect our home, planet Earth. Go speak to someone else. I'm a grumpy old woman. I haven't got time for that. The board comes in. The board comes over Australia. And what I saw is trauma-informed practice is a more humane and caring government to lead its people. A government that is more interested in the welfare of its parents to care for children rather than making parents pay for being on the welfare. A government prepared to support all agencies who work to improve the lives of children and family despite the cost, and not cut funding to agencies that's closing down our refuges to women, that's forcing you to work in short-term models and making you vie against each other for funding. Shame on them. I can tell you, I know where the shame is. I'm very clear where the shame is. A government which will recognise our first Australians, who will not turn their hearts away from imprisoned children in refugee detention centres, and who will not support any form of violence towards children in whatever corporate, institutional, political, or legal way whatsoever. We as a nation support the legal abuse of our children, and we call it family law court. And now the bird comes to land back in with us and with the agencies that we work in. And looking at us and our agencies, trauma-informed practice is agencies operating from policies and procedural guidelines which are based and informed by a holistic approach to trauma. Not a quick six-session fix-it, by the way, badly dressed as evidence-based practice. And darling, we never go to a party badly dressed. Agencies who fully train, provide reflective practice guidance and support to their workers to be creative, imaginative, and loving from a well-informed trauma practice wisdom. It is okay to love, folks. You don't get struck off as a social worker. I've been doing it for 30 years and haven't caught up with me yet. And you aren't allowed to tell these strange social workers. Shh, don't tell anybody. Agencies who employ workers who are not interested in a regime of professional superiority that separate them from the people that they serve. Trauma-informed practice looks like us rolling our sleeves up, working with our families who are struggling, who resist us, who don't want us in their lives, and who keep falling again and again and again. Trauma-informed practice looks like children moving their groove thing, moving their bodies to get rid of the toxins in the adrenal system. Children having new ways to think that will open up the neural pathways. Children singing, dancing, playing their way back to harmony, not being medicated back to harmony. Children who are in the safe haven of their families. Trauma-informed practice looks like children finding their way back to adulthood. That they can be like you and me. That children can be great and greater than the sum of their traumatic experiences. To know that as adults, they can and will sing out their unique individuality. Children who can sing as adults from the top of their voice, "What I do is me, for that I came."